Hey everyone, when we think about Christian prayer, it seems straightforward, right? But have you ever really dug into the how of it all? Today, we're diving into one specific, really central part of that tradition, the act of praying directly to Jesus. What's the biblical argument for doing this? And why is it so important? Let's get into it. So let's start with a really fundamental question. When Christians pray, who are they talking to? Now, a lot of prayers are directed to God the Father, and that's absolutely central. But there's another powerful, historically rooted practice that we're going to unpack today. And that's right, we're zeroing in on prayer that's directed specifically to Jesus. For this explainer, we're going to be like biblical detectives, piecing together the scriptural clues that build the case for this practice. We'll be walking through a source text that lays out all the key arguments, and we're going to break them down, piece by piece. Okay, so where did this even start? Is this something that came along later, or does it go all the way back to the beginning? Well, according to the source we're looking at, the foundation for this whole thing was laid by Jesus himself. And it wasn't a command, it was an invitation, a personal one that kind of changes everything. And here it is, right from the Gospel of John. The language here is so direct, you can't miss it. Notice he doesn't say, "Ask the Father in my name." He says, "Ask me." For a lot of people, this verse is the starting point, the absolute game changer. It's presented as this open invitation for a direct line of communication. So, okay, an invitation is one thing, but did anyone actually accept it? Did Jesus' first followers actually take him up on that offer? Well, let's shift from the invitation to the actual evidence. The argument here points to a really clear pattern of behavior in the early church, showing this wasn't just some theory, it was how they lived their faith. And the examples are all over the map, which really paints a picture. You've got Stephen praying at the very moment he's dying. You have the Apostle Paul asking for personal relief from something he's struggling with. You see church elders praying for the sick and whole congregations getting blessings in Jesus' name. This wasn't some rare thing. It seems it was woven right into the fabric of their daily faith. Let's just pause on this one for a second. The story of Stephen, who's known as the first Christian martyr. In his last agonizing moments, what are his final words? A direct prayer to Jesus. First, he asks Jesus to receive his spirit. And then, and this is incredible, he asks Jesus to forgive the very people who are killing him. The source material really highlights this moment as a powerful example of a faith that's personal and direct, even in the face of death. And this is where you really see the scope of this practice. It wasn't just for these huge life or death moments. On one side, you have Stephen's prayer at death's door. But on the other, you've got Paul pleading over and over for relief from what he called a thorn in the flesh, some kind of deep, personal struggle. It shows this whole spectrum of prayer, from the massive and existential to the deeply personal and intimate, all directed to Jesus. All right, so we've got the invitation from Jesus and the evidence that people put it into practice. But what's the theology behind it? What's the engine driving this whole idea? The next part of the argument gets to the why, and it hinges on a word that is absolutely central to Christian thought: fellowship. So what do we even mean by fellowship here? It's way more than just being part of the same club or group. Think of it more like a really deep friendship or a close family bond. The text here defines it as a shared life, an active living relationship. And what's the most important part of any relationship? Communication. And boom, this verse from 1 John just lays it out there. It says this active relationship, this fellowship, isn't just with God the Father, it's also with his Son, Jesus Christ. So the thinking goes, if you're in a real, active relationship with Jesus, then talking to him in prayer isn't just something you can do, it's a natural, vital part of that connection. Now we get to the last major piece of the argument. According to the text we're exploring, this is the part that really solidifies the whole case. And it all comes down to a specific phrase you see repeated in the New Testament, the idea of calling on the name of the Lord. What does that actually mean? The argument here is that this is not just some casual expression. The phrase, "to call on the name," is presented almost like a technical term. It signifies an act of worship, a direct appeal, a prayer. It's seen as a key that unlocks a deeper level of understanding about the relationship between a believer and Jesus. And this is where it all comes to a head. The Apostle Paul, writing to the church in Rome, connects this exact act, calling on the name of the Lord, directly to the biggest promise in Christianity: salvation. So the argument is, if calling on Jesus is the very thing that leads to salvation, then that act of calling is, at its core, one of the highest forms of prayer and worship there is. So let's just quickly recap the whole argument we've been building. It's basically a four-step case. It starts with a personal invitation from Jesus himself. It's backed up by how the very first Christians actually lived and prayed. It's grounded in the whole theological idea of having a direct relationship or fellowship. And it's all sealed with the meaning behind that critical phrase, to call on his name. When you weave all four of those threads together, the personal invitation, the historical practice, the relationship, and the specific language, you get the rich scriptural foundation for praying directly to Jesus, at least as it's laid out in the text we've been exploring. It's a case built not just on one verse, but on this combination of direct statements, actions, and deep theological ideas. And that kind of brings us to our final question, and maybe it's the most important one. Putting aside the theology and history for a second, what does this actually mean for someone's faith today? How does the idea of having a direct personal conversation with Jesus actually shape that relationship between a believer and the divine? It's a question that really gets to the heart of what a living faith is all about, and it's a powerful thought to end on.